Right. But rarely a hairband. I hear you.
Good morning. Welcome to the American Society of International Law. My name is Wes Rist. I'm the Director of Education and Research here. On behalf of ASIL, I'd like to thank you all for joining us. We're very happy to have you for what's become a wonderful tradition at Tiller House. Just to give you a little bit of background for those of you who are unfamiliar with the American Society of International Law, we are a 108-year-old professional membership association. We're primarily composed of lawyers, but we do have other interdisciplinary folks involved as well. We have nearly 4,000 members in over 100 countries around the world, and we are comprised of about 25 to 30% students and new professionals. So you represent a very core constituency of our membership. We're very pleased to be able to have you here today. One of the really wonderful things about ASIL is that every possible topic that you can think of that touches on international law, we have people who are very interested in that. So everything from international business transactions and finance and international economic law to international human rights law, humanitarian law, law of armed conflict, to international environmental law, the law of the sea, and space law and technology. All of these issues, whether they be very settled ones or growing ones, we have members who are very active in those fields, and so if you're interested in those fields, we have people who are looking and working on those issues. We also have some of our demographic-based focuses, like today's interest group sponsor, which is the Women in International Law Interest Group, and they're one of our preeminent interest groups. We're very pleased to be able to co-sponsor this with them every year, and I'm going to turn things over first to the first of our co-chairs who are here, Clara Brillenberg, and then Christy Edwards, who will be moderating our panel discussion today. I will allow to introduce all of our speakers. But again, thank you all very much for joining ASIL today, this morning. We're pleased to have you here, and we want to make sure that you get the most out of this event. Clara?
Good morning. Thank you again for attending, and for those who are watching online, thank you for watching from home in your pajamas. I have the pleasure of just very briefly telling you about a program that the Women in International Law Interest Group is very proud of, which is the WILIG, for short, mentoring program, where we set up up to 4 mentees with a mentor for a year, so that they can learn both from the mentor's experience and the lessons that they've learned through their career trajectory, and also, importantly, from the other mentees in the group to share similar experiences, similar difficulties that they've had, and how each other has resolved some of those issues, and some of the strategies that they've come up with, and some of the questions that they're asking that you didn't even know to ask. We just finished the application process for mentees, and it will open it up again for next year's program in next year's ASIL annual meeting in April. But of course, we are always more than happy to take more mentors. We have more demand than we can always meet. So if every one mentor that signs up is 4 more mentees that can be in the program. So if you are someone who could be a mentor with or know someone who could, please let us know. Thank you.
Thanks, Clara. My name is Christy Edwards. I joined Clara as one of the co-chairs for WILIG. In my day job, I'm the Director of International Humanitarian Law at the American Red Cross, and it's my absolute honor to be with these incredibly inspiring women, many of whom I've looked up to in my career for many years. I'm not going to give you a long overview of their bios. You do have a sheet that should have been on your seats when you came in that gives a bit more of their background, but I'll just note a few highlights, and I'll introduce the speakers briefly, and then they'll have about 10 minutes each to speak, and then we'll open it up for question and answers, because I'm sure that you all will have plenty of questions to ask all of them. And then we'll end around 9:30 to give you guys some time to network and chat with each other and also with our speakers until 10 o'clock. To my left is Betsy Anderson, and she honestly needs no introduction in this room. Until last month, she served as the executive director for ASIL. She was with ASIL for the last 8 years, and will be joining the ABA Rule of Law Initiative as their executive director in September, and they're very, very lucky to have her. She spent quite a bit of time in her career working for organizations such as Human Rights Watch, again, more time at the ABA, served as a clerk for the ICTY and also as a clerk for the U.S. District Court of the Southern District of New York. Following Betsy will be Pamela Fierst. She's a senior program officer in the State Department's Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, and we regularly get to actually chat as part of her day job, where she serves as the team leader for PRM's Multilateral Coordination and External Affairs Office, and she manages PRM's relationship with the International Committee of the Red Cross and the Red Cross Movement. So we actually get to chat outside of these kinds of events, which is great. She also served for almost 10 years in the Bureau of African Affairs, focusing on U.S. policy in Sudan and Somalia. Following Pamela will be Sandy Hodgkinson. She is now the Vice President of Planning and the Chief of Staff at Finmeccanica. I'm sorry, I just butchered that. And this is more of a transition to the private sector for her. She spent many years working for the Department of Defense and also served some time in Iraq with the Coalition Provisional Authority. And I'll let her go into more details about her long and really fascinating career with the White House, DoD, and several other organizations, also serving as a JAG. And then finally, we have Marcia Wiss, who is of counsel at Hogan Lovells, and she's been in the private practice for 25 years. Also worked at OPIC, and again, quite a long and fascinating career. She's also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University Law School and at SAIS. So I'll stop talking and leave it to them, since they're the ones that you are actually here to see. And again, they'll have each about 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions. So,
okay. Well, thanks very much, Christy, for that nice introduction. I know from long experience these microphones don't work very well, so I'm going to pull it close here. It's great to be back at Tiller House, and especially for this event, which in my 8 years here was always a highlight for me every year. This midsummer gathering of the women in our society to talk about career paths. So it's fun to be here on this side of the table. As Christy described, I've spent most of my career in the international nonprofit sector. What you can't tell from that little bio on your seats is that was not planned by any stretch of the imagination. It was kind of a mistake, or not a mistake. Obviously, it worked out very well, but a bit of a surprise for me. In law school, I did a joint degree in law and public policy, so I'm happy to answer questions about that. I think it was a good thing for me to have done. It has opened my eyes and opportunities in the policy field as well as the legal field, and vice versa. I've brought my legal tools to policy work, so I think that's a good thing to do, though not necessary. I got a joint degree, but my focus was really on domestic policy. I wanted to work on rights issues, but with very much a domestic focus. I was in graduate school and in law school very much preoccupied with domestic poverty policy, welfare policy, education policy issues, and that's really where I thought I would make my mark. Following my clerkship, I did a clerkship after law school in the Southern District of New York, and then thought I would work in that arena, either as a lawyer or as a policymaker, or probably both. But life happens, and maybe that's one of my lessons to share with you, is you need to be open to life happening. And for me, that came in the form of my partner, who I met in law school, and pretty quickly gleaned that he was somebody who was pretty internationalist in his orientation, and that I better be prepared to reinvent myself as an international rights lawyer, or at least have the flexibility to move back and forth between domestic and international if we were going to build a life together. And indeed, the year after my clerkship, he was offered an opportunity to move to the Brussels office of his law firm. And we decided that that would be an interesting adventure. And so that was a big jump for me, and I moved with him to Brussels and began that process of reinventing myself. And it was there that I had two important breaks that really launched my international law career. The first was an opportunity to clerk at the Yugoslavia Tribunal. I was in the first class of clerks in I'm dating myself now, 1995, and worked there for the better part of a year in the appellate chamber of the tribunal. And thereafter, I got a Fulbright fellowship to work with Human Rights Watch, which was at the time just opening its Brussels office, and to do work there researching the treatment of refugees and asylum seekers in Western Europe, which was an interesting time because a lot of that policymaking and lawmaking was shifting from national capitals to Brussels, with detrimental impact on refugees and asylum seekers in the region. And it was an interesting time to document that and undertake advocacy on those issues. And from there, from a year-long fellowship with Human Rights Watch, I stayed on as a consultant for another year, and eventually they got tired of my nagging, I guess, and gave me a permanent job as the Director of Advocacy for Europe and Central Asia, and then I moved up to run the Europe and Central Asia Division of Human Rights Watch. From there, then, to do development work in the rule of law and human rights field at the ABA for 3 years, and then came here to ASIL for the past 8 years, and now I'm moving back into that development sphere. So that's a little bit more detail about my path, and I want to highlight 5 lessons from that experience, especially that early experience in kind of breaking into the field from a position of disadvantage. I hadn't taken international law in law school. I hadn't done a lot of international jobs, any international jobs during law school. The summer after law school, when I began to see the writing on the wall here in my personal life, I scrambled and got a fellowship to work at what was then the Lawyers Committee for Human Rights, and then now is Human Rights First. And that was really my first opportunity in the international law field. So what are my lessons for you? One is that it's possible to transition from a purely domestic-oriented career into international. And vice versa. And I think, in fact, probably much more so than when I came up 20 years ago, these fields are blurring. And I think it would be strategic, frankly, for someone who is mapping out a career now to think about the issues and topics that interest you, and what are the domestic and international dimensions of those, and how can you develop a career that blends them and have the ability to move back and forth. And it opens up more opportunities. It gives you greater perspective. It may be that your first job opportunity is in the domestic sphere, but there are ways in which you can internationalize that experience, either in that practice or in your extracurricular activities or pro bono activities that make it position you then to make the move into international when the opportunities present. Second lesson I have is to watch the horizon. What are the emerging hot topics or new institutions or opportunities in the field? I had this insight when I was doing a panel like this with Lucy Reed, who is a past president of the Society and a very prominent international arbitration practitioner, and currently in the private sector, but she's done stints in the public sector as well. And she was telling her story and started out saying, I graduated from law school in 1979. And then she mapped out the path into international arbitration. And the light bulb went off in my mind. What happened in 1979? Anyone? The Iran hostage crisis, right? Which, of course, led to the Algiers Accords and the creation of the Iran-U.S. Claims Tribunal. And one of several of Lucy's formative experiences were representing clients before the Iran-U.S. Claims Tribunal, representing the U.S. government as its agent in The Hague, in a stint in Elle, and building from there a career in international arbitration. And in fact, there's a whole generation of international legal practitioners who came up around that period who have made careers in international arbitration. And I got out of law school in 1993. What happened in 1993? the Yugoslavia Tribunal was established. And before that, there wasn't a field of international criminal law. There wasn't a field of international criminal law practice. There was Nuremberg, and then there was a lot of academic, ruminations, but no place really to practice that. And that all changed in 1993. And now there's a whole generation of folks my age who came up in that time and have made careers in international criminal law. And I had my eyes on that horizon in 1993 when I was doing that internship at the Lawyers Committee for Human Rights. I learned about the conflict in the Balkans and about the establishment of the tribunal, and I started to follow those developments. So I was aware of that that arena, and I was prepared to talk about it when I got the lucky break of an interview with one of the judges at the Yugoslavia Tribunal and was able to land that job. And you see that pattern happening over and over again. After 9/11, of course, now there's a huge area of national security law practice. There, I think on the horizon now, or maybe we're in, beyond the horizon, but a lot of opportunity in international environmental law, opportunity in anything to do with technology, cyber, intellectual property, and probably my co-panelists will have some other ideas looking into their crystal balls about the fields of the future. So I would definitely encourage you to think about watching the horizon, and organizations like ASIL, the American Bar Association, your local bar association, your professors can help you identify those new developments, those new institutions where there may be opportunities for the future. Third lesson is be prepared to take risks and jump at opportunities when they present themselves. It may work out, may not, but you'll never know unless you take that leap. And if it doesn't work out, you can always reverse course and find something else. It can be challenging. More often than not, it will open doors to really terrific experiences. That was certainly my experience, and I've heard that story over and over again from people in the field. It requires a certain amount of entrepreneurialism and creativity, so this is really my lesson from both taking the risk of moving to Brussels, but also creating an opportunity for myself at Human Rights Watch. So at the time we were moving to Brussels, Human Rights Watch was opening that office in Brussels, and I got through a connection, a meeting with their director of human resources in New York, and I went to see him, and I said, happy coincidence, I'm moving to Brussels, you're opening a Brussels office, why don't you hire me? And he very politely said, thanks, but no thanks, we've already staffed up that office. And I can read between the lines here in your CV, you really haven't done very much in international. And I was maybe desperate, or at least not cowed by that, and said, what if I come with my own funding? And if I can get a fellowship to do some work on a topic of interest to Human Rights Watch, would you be willing to host me in that work, give me a desk and a computer, sponsor the research, publicize it, that sort of thing? And perhaps to get rid of me, he said, sure, whatever, let us know. And but they wrote the letter when I found that I think I could make a pitch to Fulbright that this was a Fulbright-worthy project to work on the treatment of refugees and asylum seekers in Western Europe. Human Rights Watch wrote the letters saying that they would be willing to sponsor the research, and that came through. And just at the time that my clerkship at the Yugoslavia Tribunal was coming to an end, that opportunity opened up, and obviously then led to an 8-year stint at Human Rights Watch. And I've seen that happen in the nonprofit sector many times with friends and colleagues. Nonprofits rarely have enough money to hire all the people that they want to hire and to create opportunities for folks. And the way to get in the door is often through a fellowship or volunteer work, but creating opportunities that make you known in such organizations, and then when positions open up, you're maybe the first one in line. Fourth lesson is the importance of gaining country and language expertise. And this also, you don't know when this will necessarily come in handy, but it's a useful thing to have in your hip pocket. For me, before I decided that I wanted to focus on domestic rights issues and poverty policy issues, in undergraduate school I had been a Russian studies major and spent a summer in what was then the Soviet Union, and I was really very much focused and had studied Russian for 4 years in college, and very much focused on that. Then, of course, the transition occurred in the end of the 80s, early 90s, and so when I went to law school, I thought, well, that's yesterday's news. So that's when I made my shift. But then when I moved back into human rights and working for the American Bar Association, Central European Eurasian Law Initiative, I was able to resuscitate that Russian language and area expertise, and it really gave me credibility to work in that field that I don't think I would have otherwise had. And again, I heard David Crane, whom some of you may know, was the first prosecutor at the Special Court for Sierra Leone, give a presentation about his path, and he had a similar kind of story. Before he pursued a career in the military for 30 years, in college and graduate school, he decided he was really interested in Africa, African studies. So for graduate school, he went and got a master's, I think in international relations, but with a focus on West Africa, just because it was interesting to him. And then he went off and had his career in the military, but then in the early 2000s, when it came time to find a prosecutor for the Special Court for Sierra Leone, he rose above others in part because he had West Africa experience from that master's 30 years before. And so that, I think, is an interesting lesson. I encourage people, take your summers, develop your language skills, take your summers to travel to parts of the world that are interesting to you. It does help distinguish you. My last bit of advice, and I'm probably at my 10 minutes or beyond, is the value of connections. And pretty much every opportunity I have had in the international law field has been a function of connections. And I want to underscore, should be obvious with this panel in this room, it's not any longer an old boys network, but it is still a network. And it's important to work it and develop it for yourself. And you can do that in lots of ways through your studies. Your professors are great mentors and advisors and can open doors for you. The people you work for during the summers and your first jobs are critically important. And importantly, you do not know who it is who's going to open the door for you. So again, from my experience, my great break was that clerkship at the Yugoslavia Tribunal. It's where I found an area of practice that I loved. It was an incredibly exciting time to be at the tribunal when it was really starting. And that break came from an unlikely connection. It was the judge I'd clerked for in the Southern District of New York, who didn't know anything at all about international law, didn't have any international law connections. When I told her I was moving to Brussels, she said, "Great, I wish you well. I'm not sure I can help very much." But it happened to be that in that fall, after I moved to Brussels, no, it was in the winter after I moved to Brussels, she was at a conference at NYU on international law and domestic courts. And she happened to sit at the conference next to George Abisab, who was a judge, the Egyptian judge at the Yugoslavia Tribunal. And they struck up a conversation, and he, being from a civil law background and an academic predominantly, was curious about law clerks. He said, this is not a tradition we have. I don't really know. I'm supposed to hire a law clerk. But tell me, where do I find one? How do you use law clerks in your court? And she said, well, that's very interesting. I can tell you very much how I use law clerks, and I think I have a law clerk for you. And she brokered an interview for me, and he hired me on the spot. And it was an incredible lucky break, but it was very much a function of that connection, her mentorship, and her willingness to open that door for me. So that's my last comment. I know I have other things I want to say about the ability of women to have it all, and maybe that'll come up in questions and answers. I should say, in the midst of all this, I have had 3 children, and they are 18, 15, and 9. I do think that women, yes, you can have it all, depending on how we define all. And I know others on the panel have thoughts about that too, and happy to talk about it in the discussion time.
Thanks so much, Betsy. Pamela?
Sure. That's a tough act to follow. I'm inspired. If you're not, you might not be listening. So right, from one very lofty set of experiences, I can tell you my tale is the humble beginnings of a steelworker's daughter who knew nothing about international life and sounded a little crazy and a bit like an upstart to my family when I, at a very young age started bandying about dreams of moving to Paris and speaking French and living some kind of glamorous lifestyle. I knew nothing about what all of that would entail. I just knew it sounded pretty good, and it was certainly different than where I grew up. So when international law kind of came on the scene, I don't know, I probably junior high when I started thinking about international law. And again, I had no idea what it meant. I didn't have any mentors. I didn't have any lawyers in the family. It was just kind of me struggling and figuring out, well, what comes next? And at every stage kind of convincing my parents, no, really, this can work, And after a certain point, they just kind of stood back and said, okay, whatever she's going to do, she's going to do. Can't stop her. And so, I went to college and go Big Ten and studied abroad while I was there and learned to speak French and thought I was well on my way and had definite designs that I was going to go to law school and I was going to practice international corporate law and it was going to be very glamorous and I was going to be very wealthy and that's how that was going to work. And again, at every turn, my steelworker father just kind of scratched his head and didn't really know what to make of me, but okay. And so, lo and behold, when I graduated from college, I was kind of like, I don't know that I want to go to law school. Like, what do you do then, right? You'd been dreaming of this your whole life, and suddenly you're like, crap, what now? So I took a year off, also to the disappointment of my father, and moved to D.C. and ended up working for a trade association that did government affairs work, like a lot of them do in D.C., and got kind of my first probably actual exposure to what it meant to work with the government on issues, understanding how the U.S. system really works, right, from kind of the ground up. The stuff that I think if you're from the East Coast or you're from D.C. that you might take for granted because you're just like, oh yeah, it's Congress, oh yeah, Dad's a lobbyist, like that's just how it works, But from where I came from, it was just stuff you read about in the papers, and that was kind of it, So it was really exciting. It was a learning experience, and after a year there, I thought, well, I am definitely too smart to stay here. I need to go back to law school. And so I had deferred law school for a year, always have a backup plan, and I accepted my position in law school, and I went. But again, I was still convinced that I was going to have this corporate international law experience, and it was going to be great. Except I didn't really like those classes. But I didn't really know what to do with those kind of competing emotions, right? I loved the thought of international life, international living, international education, but in practice, I hadn't really been exposed to what that looked like. And so it was my first summer in law school where they tell you, it doesn't really matter, you can do whatever. I kind of think they're lying because it's a really important time to hone your interests, right? It doesn't necessarily mean, if you don't get that law firm job your first summer, you're a failure. That's not what it means. But it does give you a chance to kind of hone your interests. And so I ended up working for the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, going into an election year, working on steel tariffs. So the office was really impressed that the steelworker's daughter was in law school and wanted to learn more about how trade policy was made, and there were it was a charged political issue, steel tariffs. Go figure. And I knew a little bit about the industry. And so, steelworker's daughter does good and finds herself in these really fascinating conversations, getting calls from the White House, what do you do? And I started kind of without really noticing it, I started to gravitate towards the policy aspects of law, which I found fascinating. I didn't know that's what I was doing at the time. I just was enjoying it. Well, it turns out that at the time, the largest steel company in the world was headquartered in Paris. And so I worked connections, and I managed to get a job with them my second summer, working in their international legal affairs department. And so I got kind of the other perspective. So imagine there I am, right? I'm living in Paris, I'm speaking French, I'm working with this big corporation. I'm like, this is awesome. And it was nowhere near as interesting to me as the work I'd been doing the summer before. So, long story short, when the State Department offered me a job doing policy, I recalled an interview that I'd had with a local firm in Indiana who looked at my resume from the time that I'd been at the trade rep's office and asked, why do we care about the World Trade Organization? And I thought, oh my God, I need to get out. And so when the State Department offered me that job working on foreign policy and not in the traditional practice of law, even in the international sphere, it just kind of spoke to me. And before I knew what I was doing, there I was working on Darfur. We had just declared genocide. This was when Sudan was one country. I got to work on issues on preventing violence against women, enforcing policy with the government of Sudan to do what it could to prevent rape of IDPs outside the camps. And I spent 5 years doing that, and it was pretty great. But after a while, you kind of need to do something different. So I took on Somalia instead. Not exactly the easier transition, perhaps, but another interesting basket of issues. And then you got to move on from that, too. And so I now work with the International Committee of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Movement. For those who might not be as familiar, the International Committee of the Red Cross is mandated by the Geneva Convention to respond to humanitarian situations created by conflict. So you can imagine that there is a lot of interesting issues that come from that, but they're also charged with promoting the adherence to international humanitarian law or the law of armed conflict. And the movement generally, such as our colleagues at the American Red Cross, have that same mandate. So I'm still very much in the mix on international law and international legal issues, albeit from the humanitarian perspective, nowhere near the corporate world where I thought I was meant to be. And so, I like you, wake up every day thinking, how can I make today a little bit better and a little more interesting, and how can I keep finding those opportunities? Because it's a little bit of a combination of stuff happens to you, which is true, it does, stuff does happen to you, but it's also, where do you want to take it? You're kind of only limited in the early stages of your career, but frankly throughout your career, by your own imagination. Like, where do you want to go? Where do you want to take it? Don't be afraid, as our first speaker was saying wisely, don't be afraid to take risks, but also don't hesitate to stop and say, is what I was looking for really what I want? Because you might be surprised by the answer. I would also be willing to talk about having it all. I don't have children, but I do love yoga, and I'm opening a yoga studio. So, some people don't have children, some people have children, some people have yoga studios. That's how I look at it. So I'm happy to talk about, living the full spectrum of your life in any kind of creative way you want. At the end of the day, you really are limited only by your own imagination. Those are my words.
Thank you.
Sure.
Sandy?
Great. Thanks. Use hers. It's already fixed. Well, great. This has been terrific. Is this on? To listen to the first two speakers. Obviously, there'll be a lot of similarities in what I say to what they've said, so I'll try to give the wave tops and focus in on a couple points that I want to sort of emphasize on transitions, family, and people. But I'll start a little bit with my own background. I came in through the JAG Corps, so I was not a militaristic young lady. I love sports. I still play every sport there is, and I'm still a big runner. But by no means would I have been considered a likely candidate for the military growing up. And even my brother, who actually went into the military before me, the day that I called him and said, I think I'm actually going to apply to the JAG Corps. He, as a senior naval officer at that point, and still as a senior naval officer, said, Sandy, you have to take orders. I'm like, I can do that. I can do that, And here I am, actually 19 years later, as a reserve officer about to put on captain. So I did it. I followed the orders, but I did them my own way a little bit, as much of my path has been. So the JAG Corps for me was basically just a way to get out and do international work. I always knew I wanted to do it. Grew up in Maine and Colorado, not really international places, big dreams as well. Studied French as a kid, then Spanish. Loved everything international. I have a big doll collection that started when I was like 6 of foreign dolls. My husband still rues the day that collection began because it's grown and it's taken over the house. But always wanted to do that. And so I studied, law and language and all the things that I thought would give me great opportunities. And then I was going to join the military because I saw that, the Navy had opportunities to travel overseas and do different things. And I thought I could do that for 3 years, could learn a lot, and then translate that into some other government career. I didn't have any connections anywhere, and I thought maybe I could make some of my own. So it worked very well for me. I mean, I had, through law school, done much of what you've heard from the previous two speakers. I did a joint degree in international affairs and in law. I studied French, I studied Spanish, I studied a summer in Mexico, I studied at The Hague, I studied, a year abroad in Paris. I mean, I did everything I possibly could to be international on a budget, by the way. I never had a job, actually, that I wasn't paid for. So sometimes I scooped ice cream at night and studied French later. But it wasn't always super glamorous, but it was an exciting path anyway. And so when I came into the JAG Corps, I did end up getting international assignments. I did exactly the kind of thing that Betsy said and others have said about, making your interests known. I made it very clear that I was in the JAG Corps because I wanted to do international legal work and that I would love to travel anywhere they had. Give me your worst country, I'll do it, whatever you can let me do. And I made that known repeatedly to everybody who supervised me. And so in my 6 years on active duty, I spent 3 years traveling the world, going to about 25 countries a year, training them in human rights and international law. So it's the IMET program, which Congress funds for the military to go travel around and do this. I was one of the lucky officers who got to actually do that for a living. So it was incredible experience for me. Been all over the world doing that, and I spent 2 years living in Naples, Italy, as a prosecutor and as the international law officer there, and then 1 year here clerking in D.C. at the appellate court. So for 6 years of my Navy career, I really did get to do international work, and throughout my time in the reserves, I continue to be called on for those kinds of missions. So I do a lot of international work as part of my reserve hat that I only wear certain times of the year. So from there, I knew I wanted to keep doing this international legal work. I'd already been 3 years longer in the military than I thought, but it was great. So I went to the State Department. And at the State Department, I never took a legal job in the government, interestingly. I've been all in policy work since then. Spent years at the State Department in Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor Bureau, later at the SWCI, which used to be the Deputy of the War Crime Ambassador job that I had there. They detailed me to the White House for a while, to the NSC. They sent me to a year in Iraq. Incidentally, about 3 days after my husband and I decided it was time to start having a family. So we'll get back to that. Baghdad is not always where that would begin. And so then I went to DOD and continued to move forward there in my career. I was at the DASD for Detainee Affairs. Let me be very clear, when I went to law school, I was writing letters for Amnesty International to free Nelson Mandela. I've always been a human rights advocate. And there I was in charge of Guantanamo Bay. So again, we'll come back to transitions in your life. I continued my career there, ultimately working as the Chief of Staff for the Deputy Secretary of Defense. And then I left the government a couple years ago to go to the private sector, which wasn't necessarily in my trajectory either, because that boss I had became the CEO of an internationally based defense company based out of Rome, and we had the North American office here in Arlington, Virginia. So it was a transition, unexpected, and I'll focus on a couple of the details for that. So on these themes, transitions, I've done a varied career. I mean, from the military to the public sector and now to the private sector. And in most of those varied careers, the basic elements of the job have been the same. I mean, I do think it's helpful to have language background. I mean, I'm now working for a company headquartered in Rome. It's great that I studied Italian for all those years, and I lived a couple years in Italy in my military career. That helps because it matters, even if it's limited language. Just learn a few phrases, and it really makes people feel that you are there with them. You know, it's big and it's an important thing. Do get the travel experience abroad, whatever it is, whenever it is, make it work. So when somebody calls you and says, "Hey, we need somebody to go down and do something in Bogota," and you think, "Well, that's really not convenient. That was the week I was supposed to do this or that." Just do it. Just, you know, when these opportunities come up, seize them, because you never know who you're going to meet and what kinds of experiences you'll have and how you can use that in a resume in the future. Granted, I never expected, again, to have Guantanamo Bay as part of my day-to-day existence as a young human rights advocate. But at the same time, the skill sets that I had from a human rights background and the perspectives I brought to it made it such a rewarding experience. I mean, so much more rewarding than had I grown up always thinking that, great, someday maybe I'll oversee military detention facility. I mean, that wasn't the passion, but I feel I brought passion to the job from my other experiences. The transition to the private sector was not at all intended. And when we talk about family choices in a minute, I partly made that decision because I'd been working all the way up in the Defense Department. I was in SES. I wasn't sure what I was going to do next. And a former boss calls and says, "Have I got a great opportunity for you? More money, fewer hours, and international connections." And I was like, "But in the defense industry?" And so I took the interview and took the job, thinking it was the best thing for my family and everybody at the time, not necessarily because I had always wanted to do this, but it's been fabulous and fascinating and challenging, because what you don't realize when you stay in the same path over the years is you kind of lose some of that spark, you know, some of that excitement that you had when you're first learning things and doing them for the first time. Once you become an expert, it actually gets a little more boring. You can solve the problem quickly, but it's not as satisfying for you. And so now I really am faced with things that I don't know the answer. And it's kind of fun to go back to trying to figure it out. So it keeps the career alive, I think. On family, so I do have 4 children. In fact, their ages are 7, 5, 3, and I have a 3-month-old. And, you know, the proverbial juggle every day means that I don't catch all the balls. And fortunately, I'm okay with that. I mean, right now, as we speak, a moving truck is unloading stuff in my house, and my husband is standing there with a 3-month-old watching them, saying, "Okay, this goes in that bedroom, this goes in that bedroom." And so, you know, but I feel strongly enough that these are the kind of events that are important, and that it's important to stay connected to who you are professionally, even when you have family commitments, that we do our best to juggle them. And so, you know, for those of you who haven't selected lifetime partners yet, choose wisely, because it's as much a part of your career as all the effort that you've put in so far. And so, you know, I ended up marrying the guy in the office next door to me up in Newport, Rhode Island, who was the Army officer traveling the world when I was the Navy officer. And so when I said I want to go to the State Department, he went to the State Department. When I got detailed to Baghdad, when we were going to start family planning, he basically called the next day and said, "Put me on the list. I want to be the next civilian you send to Baghdad." And so 3 months later, we were sharing a trailer in Baghdad. And it did not begin our family there. So I hope you all feel better knowing that. But it's a constant juggle. I mean, you know, there are some things that I miss. I do the best I can to get to all of it. My kids know that my earnest desire is to be with them, but that part of the reason we can do some of the things we can do as a family is because I work and I earn a salary. And even in my day career, I have never had a problem with, you know, now 4 different pregnancies over the course of, you do the math, 8 years, several different bosses and work environments, because I've been transitioning, and everybody's been fine with it. I mean, I've always been honest from the beginning, as soon as I feel it's the right time to tell them, but I've never turned down a job that was offered to me. I never said, I can't do that because I'm about to start a family or I'm going to have a baby next year. In fact, I took on a promotion right when I announced my pregnancy for this fourth child. They had just offered me the opportunity to step up and head strategic planning. I was at week 10. I didn't want to tell them. I stalled for 2 weeks. And I said, well, listen, I want to be very honest with you. I very much think I'm the right person for this job, but I am pregnant. And I do need to take time off, and I expect to do that because that's the right thing for me to do. I hope the job's still available. And of course, the answer is yes. And so I really do think that you should always, at those times in your life, just take the opportunity, go with it, and you will figure it out. You're all smart, brilliant women, which is why you're where you are today. Last thing I'll say about people in my last minute is that because it's a network out there, I really do think you want to keep track of people you meet and where you know them from, and do right by people. You know, there were a lot of women who I would have liked to have looked up to earlier in my career, but they weren't necessarily looking down to pull others up. I mean, they were happy where they were, and life was great for them. But I do think it's incumbent upon all of us to reach down and pull people up and to make sure they realize that this is an era for women who are motivated, hardworking, and want to balance family and work. And I think that you'll find around you that it's a badge of honor. It's not something that you have to hide, you know, your personal life or your marital life or anything like that from work. I really think it's time to seize the moment for that. And so through mentorship and other things, remember people, take care of them. And I'll finish with one funny anecdote, because when you get back to the people stuff versus the pure smart stuff, when I was being interviewed for my job at the White House to be Director of International Justice, Condoleezza Rice was the National Security Advisor, and she was my last interview. And I was so focused on the substance of what the job entailed. I studied, I prepared, I knew every question she was going to ask, and I was ready. And the one thing I forgot to do was look back at her resume and try to do the dots, like where would we have a personal conversation? And the first question she asked me was, so, who was your favorite professor in grad school? And I had forgotten at that moment that she was an alma mater of the same school I went to. Couldn't think of a single professor I'd had. Couldn't even do it. And I sat there just dumbfounded, sweating. And I came up with the name of a teaching assistant. And she looked at me, she's like, yeah, I don't know her. And I was like, anyway, so, but I loved Denver, loved living out there, and so I tried to change the subject. But it brought back to me, like, common sense. Look at the resume. Do the connections. Try to figure that out so that you're prepared for the social side, the personal side of the conversation, not the here's what I know side. Anyway, that's what I've got to say.
Great, thanks. Thank you. And that was the best ad that we could possibly give for the mentoring program, so thank you. Marcia?
Exactly. So I'm Marcia Wiss, and I think I was asked to speak for two reasons. One, I probably do represent big law on the panel. Nobody is admitted to having been in a big law firm. And two, I'm the oldest by a long shot. So let me go back into a little bit of my background and how I got interested in international. My father was in the Army, a West Point graduate, and therefore I really didn't have a choice of where I lived. I lived when I was 6 years old in Japan for a year, which is fascinating. I lived for 4 years when I was a teenager in Berlin, pre-divided Berlin, and then divided Berlin. So I was very international. I'm what's called an Army brat. And we have certain characteristics. We're a little bit shallow, but we meet well. We're good at a cocktail party. But we don't necessarily have the depth that somebody who maybe grew up in Indiana in a small steel town where you really know people. But we move around, and we do get to know people because we've been posted there. So when I got back from Berlin, we went to Detroit, where my father was at the Tank Automotive Center, and my parents wanted to put me in a Catholic girls' school. So, and I loved it. It was during the civil rights period. The nuns were just incredibly brilliant, dedicated, wonderful women. And I thought my high school guidance counselor was just fantastic. So I asked her, how do I become a high school guidance counselor? And she said, well, it really doesn't make any difference what you do in college. You can study anything because your master's degree is what determines what you are going to do. So I said, cool, this is great. So I checked different colleges, and a friend actually who lived at White Sands Proving Ground with me next door to me when I was growing up, second grade and third grade, was at Georgetown. And so he gave me a great tour. I thought that this was wonderful. And I got into the School of Foreign Service. I thought, it doesn't sound very much like high school guidance counseling, but after all, Sister Rose said, didn't really make any difference. So I went there. It was really the dark ages. There were 225 students, 25 women, 200 men. Georgetown was basically a man's school. So a totally different world in many respects. Then when I graduated, I did take the Foreign Service exam and passed the written, went to the oral. I don't know how many of you have taken the Foreign Service exam. It's very intimidating. 3 senior Foreign Service officers at a panel ask you questions, including the social question. The social question of the day was, everybody smoked, of course. And so the guys were asked what to do about stubbing out a cigarette and whether it was proper to put it in the cuff of their pants. That was the days when pants went down and then up, there was a little cuff. And so the exam was that kind of social, how would you be as a exemplar of the United States at a cocktail party in Paris? And they asked me, why have you decided to go into the Foreign Service? And I said, well, actually, I've decided not to go into the Foreign Service. Long pause. And I said, I found out that if I go in the Foreign Service, I'm 22 years old, if I do decide ever to marry, that I have to resign my commission. And so I was unceremoniously scooted out, and about a year later, the rule changed. And I would like to think that the little bomb that I dropped in the middle of my oral exam for the Foreign Service may have had something to do with that. So it was during the Vietnam War. I did what a lot of people did in those days, just go straight into law school willy-nilly without particularly thinking. The guys were essentially going off to Vietnam. I'm going to ask a question. How many people think the number of women in my class was less than 10%? Raise your hand. Yeah, 7% in the class of 72. So it was a different world. It was totally different. And when I graduated, I was very interested in the civil rights movement. I had been a clerk during the summer at the Justice Department in the Civil Rights Unit, and that was the coolest job I had had. I'd been with a law firm one summer, I'd been with the Civil Rights Division one summer, and I'd been with a congresswoman's office, Martha Griffiths from Detroit, one summer. And the best job was justice. So I went into justice but did civil, which is totally different. And during the first year that I was there, I always tell people, if you're sort of interested in changing jobs, one of the networking things you should do is do lunch. So an old boyfriend with whom I was not hostile, invited me to lunch, and he was leaving OPIC, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. And I asked him kind of boldly, who's taking your job? And he said, well, no one. And so I competed for it, and I was not qualified because you had to have 5 years of Wall Street law firm experience. But it was the first time, it was sort of the coincidence thing, you know, what happened in '79, what happened in '93. Well, OPIC had just opened its doors, and the Allende expropriations were occurring in Chile. And there was arbitration that was coming out of those claims. And so they said, well, you've got a litigation background. You know, I had 10 months of being at the Justice Department. You know, we can use you. And so I got the job. But because of my travels, it took about 6 months to get a security clearance. And so when I finally got there, they had hired somebody more qualified who had 8 years of experience litigating at Covington. So they sort of thought, what on earth are we going to do with her? So they put me in the project finance unit. There were 2 of us. There was my boss and me. I like to call myself the deputy to the assistant general counsel for project finance at OPIC. And that's what I've been doing ever since. So I've been focused on international project finance and investment in developing countries. I particularly like to look at it from a development perspective. I really feel that what I'm doing is raising the development level of the country, the people I'm working with. I like the idea of electricity. You know, you turn the switch and the lights go on. I'm doing a project in Al-Anbar right now, where hopefully when you turn the switch, the lights are going to go on in Al-Anbar province of western area of Iraq. I've represented the Israel Electric Corporation for 25 years with their electricity generation. Done a lot of work in India, have been historically co-head of our India practice group, and generally do work in the developing countries. Right now it tends to be more in the Middle East. But over the years, it's really been pretty much all over. So on the side, I've been teaching 30 years at Georgetown, International Project Finance and Investment, and at SAIS now about a decade probably to non-lawyers, international investment law. And for me, that gives me an opportunity to see what young people are thinking. I do mentor a lot. So I mentor my students at Georgetown and at SAIS. And it's fascinating for me to see what they're going through. And frankly, to be brutally honest, it's a whole lot harder than it was for me. And I mean, things were not piece of cake for me, but it's a whole lot harder now. And when I think, for example, of big law, which I think is one of the reasons I've been asked to speak, it is really hard to get into a big law firm these days unless you do the formula. And the formula is go to one of the top 10 law schools, be in the top 10% of your class, get a clerkship during your summer, although now we're sort of spreading that between not only second year, but you can also get first year clerkships because of some of the screw-ups that occurred during the 2008 slowdown period. And then you get an offer, and then you go in with that law firm, because that really is the formula. I think 80% of the people who are associates in our firm have gone through that procedure. I recommend, if you have an opportunity to split your summer between 2 firms, do it, because otherwise whatever firm you happen to get a summer with, you're stuck with. It's sort of like an arranged marriage. You just end up being there forever. In Washington, I think it's a little bit different because of the regulatory, the importance of regulatory agencies. And so it is possible to be with USTR, be with an agency that has has work in the private sector. We do a lot of sanctions work. So people who've been in commerce or treasury, not particularly on the international side, but we do a lot of FDA work, food work, medical device work, pharmaceutical work. Some of it is international, but not necessarily. But if you've been in those agencies that give you the background on how the regulations work and solving the problems for the clients, that's another way to get a job in big law. And I'm pleased to answer any questions that you may have about other routes if you haven't gone the traditional route. About family, I started my family late. My daughter was born when I was my son was born when I was 36, and my son when I was 38. My husband was a Foreign Service officer. Yeah, exactly. Just a kid. My late husband was a Foreign Service officer who'd sort of done everything. And so my husband actually became Mr. Mom. He was the guy at home. So choosing the right spouse is really important. Cannot overemphasize it. And if there's any regret that I have, I was just talking with somebody about it recently, it's not having dinner with my family as much as I would like to. So when I sort of think about juggling the balls and what ball falls, there were a lot of family dinners that I should have been at that I missed. So that's it for me.
Thank you all so much for just your fascinating stories and your advice. But I want to open it up to the rest of the room because I'm sure you all have lots of questions, and certainly the question of how do you have it all, or how do you get there? And it's a fascinating one for me, and I'm sure many of you in the room. So, are there microphones that we can pass around, or shall I walk around with mine? I'm happy to. Okay.
I was just wondering, a few of you touched on this, but the decision to go into more of a policy route versus a traditional legal route, I know that's something I'm struggling with, and I was wondering if you kind of made the decision and sort of focused more on policy, or if it's just kind of cast a wide net, what your advice would be.
I'll give a few thoughts on this. I didn't choose to go necessarily into policy, but it worked that way. I think an advantage in the State Department certainly was, there is this formula. If you're going into a law firm, you generally, once you really want to go into a legal track, I think you really need to start it earlier. It's harder to go into a legal track later. So that's a disadvantage if you really want to do pure legal type of work. For me, I was open to whatever work it was as long as it fit my interests of international, travel and policy and the things that I like to do. And what I found in my own career was that it was easier to move around when you were a policy person than it was as a counsel person. I mean, they just don't have quite as many legal opportunities to transition. And so it was a more lateral career move. I could make a lot more. I could move up and maneuver through the system a little bit better. But it probably, if I had ever gone back and tried to apply to a counsel's office job, they would have said, why have you not been practicing law? And, so those are kind of the trade-offs, I think.
I think a few things that I'd probably add to that, and others with perhaps more of a background with how state's legal advisor's office hires. They're very formulaic, so if you're not at one of those top 5 or 10 law schools, a lot of the more prestigious government agencies really don't recruit at your school, so you might not kind of know that that's out there, is one thing. But also with respect to kind of policy versus law, it was just, for me, it was just kind of about what spoke to me and what I found the most interesting. I think that there, in my experience and observation, there is more flexibility on the policy side. When I was in law school, a gentleman came to speak with us who said, and this is totally the wrong forum to give this advice, but he said, 2 weeks before you graduate from law school, drop out. Because once you're labeled a lawyer, no one will ever think of you differently. I reject the categories. I don't really like that outlook, but I have found that people more easily know what to do with you when you say, I'm a lawyer, Whereas if you show up with these interests and backgrounds and talents and whatnot, they're kind of like, where do we put you? So it's up to you to really kind of focus and shine the spotlight on what you want them to see.
I was just curious about how you've seen the perception of international law sort of by the US government and by the US population in general sort of over the years, and how that's impacted on your careers and navigating things and just attitudes to international law.
So this has actually been a real preoccupation of mine since I really discovered international law. So I think there's a lot more awareness of international law in the U.S. Legal system than there was 20 years ago. When in law school, there was usually one international law class semester. And maybe 2, maybe there'd be public international law and an IBT, and those were the options. But there weren't so many, all these clinics and subspecialties. As I said, there wasn't any international criminal law, didn't exist really as a subject for study or practice. So on the one hand, there's been a huge growth in awareness within the legal sector. But we obviously have a long, long way to go. We're kind of in a funny transitional moment, maybe, and a generational change, where I think people who've come up more recently in law school and been exposed to all this international law are now moving into practice. And I can't, frankly, wait till you're all there and you're the senior partners and you're the judges, and our system becomes kind of less isolationist and more internationalized. And this is frankly one of the things that drove me to move from international human rights and international legal development to work for the last 8 years at the American Society of International Law, because I really felt like this was a uniquely important organization to advance the cause of international law in the U.S. legal system. So it's something that is evolving. I think it is one of the dynamics that makes finding a path in international law for young U.S. attorneys challenging, but that there can only be a growth and opportunity in the years to come. And some of what's going to happen is you're going to make that opportunity. That's where your kind of entrepreneurialism will be very transformative, I hope, of our legal system.
Let me just add one experience that I had that I think may be illustrative. I had always considered myself an international lawyer, and I always used to say, I don't do windows, I don't do domestic work. I just do international. And I was at a firm then called Wilmer, Cutler and Pickering, and I was in the international group, and I was happy. And then important people in the firm, including Lloyd Cutler, decided that everything was really international, that our litigation arbitration was both domestic and international, our, you name it, corporate, across the board, antitrust. And he thought it made no sense to have an international group, a standalone international group. It didn't. What did it add, after all? And I was quite taken aback and irritated, but I had less of a vote than Lloyd Cutler at Wilmer, Cutler and Pickering, and so I lost that one. And I think there's a lot to that. I think that people have evolved in their thinking, and the distinctions between what is international and what is domestic are are eroding.
I wanted to thank our second two speakers for speaking a little bit more about family and work-life balance and having it all. And I was wondering if our first two speakers, who kind of reserved their comments on that, could share on that as well. And also, you know, for any of you that have further comments to add, that would be great.
So I would second you know, everything that's been said on this. I think your partner is critically important, in having somebody who is supportive of and embraces work-life balance, and you have a relationship where you will do some trading off. There are times when my partner has been, you know, really gunning, and you know, I've taken the greater load at home, and then there have been other times when those roles have shifted. I think actually traveling is really a valuable exercise in this, because when you're away, you know, they have to seize the reins and play Mr. Mom, and that's a really important balancing in our culture to enforce. My husband likes to say that our children always get hurt when I'm away. And it's not because he's not a good caregiver, it's just like, you know, the slip and fall thing happens. And, you know, he's been at the emergency room where, you know, they're saying, where's her mother? And he's Albania. And that's actually a really useful kind of balancing exercise we've found in our relationship. I think having, you know, to be very honest, being flexible and being able to transition when you need to. And this is not just about kids. It might be that you have a parent who needs care at some point in your life, or you know, you decide that it's time to open the yoga studio, or I think life is long, and there are lots of different episodes when. And you don't know. You're going to have children, and you know, one of them might be a breeze to raise, and the other, you know, poses real challenges and really needs your attention. And that changes throughout the course of their childhood too, when they need you and when they don't. And it's in surprising ways. I tell people, it's not necessarily the first 3 years when they need you. In my experience, you know, other people have been very good at giving them a bottle and changing their diapers, but it's for me, it was 13, 14, 15 when they're asking difficult questions or encountering difficult things in their lives, that it's been more important for me to be available to them. But that's very idiosyncratic, very personal to the kid, to you, to your family. And so you just kind of have to feel your way in a way, and be flexible, or prepared to be flexible when circumstances present themselves that require you to adjust the balance a little bit. Part of my spending the last 8 years at ASIL was not only a bold ambition to change the U.S. legal system, but also an opportunity to keep my hand in things international without actually being in Albania all the time. And that period of time has been an important one for my family. So that's my advice on that score.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I don't have children. I am getting married this fall, but you know, we are giving birth to a yoga studio in the meantime. You know, and whether children are a part of the equation or not is the questions of life balance and the choices that you have on what you do with your career don't really go away, regardless of the stage of life that you're in, right? And a very respected law professor of mine said, you know, having a law degree gives you choices. And I've always kind of looked at it that way, right? So as long as you're kind of holding the reins of how your career goes, or you've got an idea, or you're able to kind of make choices and navigate things, and you do have a strong partner, and you have kind of the foundation right, you're always going to face choices about lifestyle and how you spend your time, and where you spend your time, and what you do with it. And you know, so finding the right path for you and making sure that you preserve the flexibility that you want to preserve isn't something that you have to give up anymore. I think years ago it was you must be married to your job, you must be there 15 hours a day, you must, and I think those tendencies are probably evolving and for the better, and you should all be a part of the voice that says you get to choose how your flexibility comes out in the workplace.
Yeah, and I want to add a couple alibis to what's been said, because I mean, honestly, if I had been sitting in this room 10 years ago, you would not be thinking of asking me about work-life balance, because I didn't have kids. I was working around the clock, and the truth is, everything comes in stages, and women are actually particularly good, I think, at being able to compartmentalize and have lists and organize and multitask. It's a talent that the Mr. Moms don't necessarily inherently have. I mean, they're trainable, but it's hard. I mean, but we can do lots of things. And so you have to prioritize the family in a way that isn't a blanket priority. It doesn't mean I have to be home all the time. But, last year I used to once a month go and lead the Girl Scout troop for my daughter, because it was important for me to play a role in certain significant things. And so, I coached her ski team. I mean, these are the kinds of things that I would try to do so that I was really involved, and it doesn't make up for the fact that I'm not at the playground every afternoon to pick them up like some of the other moms. It's a choice you make. But my children fully appreciate the fact that you do prioritize certain things, whether it's the family dinner, whether it's sporting events or whatever, you do need to prioritize them. And a second one on the Mr. Mom thing, my husband kind of jokes about it, but he has his own career, and as does Betsy's husband, and they're both very successful and have their own good careers. But the truth is, one of the benefits that they realize, I think, as certainly my husband does, is he is so close to his children because of the times when I've traveled. I mean, he has an ability in a way with them that his friends actually envy. I mean, because he knows what to do when everything goes wrong, and he knows how to calm a child, and he knows exactly what to do. And a lot of his friends always say, I just don't know, how do you do it? How do you do it? And he's, because I've had to, and so it's the same with balancing all of it. You won't know how to do it until you have to, but, it's amazing what we can prioritize and juggle when we need to. And so I actually really believe that this is just a new era for women, because all around me, women who are pregnant, who have young children, who have grown children, they're all moving up into leadership positions all around us. And no one is making them feel that they had to make a choice to do that. And if someone's making you feel that you have to make a choice, think carefully about how you respond to that decision. I wouldn't probably back down. I would think of a new approach in that environment, because I don't think people who aren't allowing women to make these choices are going to be around for very long. I really don't. So, make the choices that value to you. Age is all relative. I had my first child at 35, and that's young by some standards. So, and I think I'm wiser now as I raise them than I would have been 15 years ago. So, and we had a lot of fun back then. So now our retirement's just later.
Well, one quick two-finger. Something I meant to mention that I want to get in here is, don't be afraid of male bosses on this issue.
Yeah.
I agree that, having women in leadership positions, creates important mentors, and those of us who have gotten to a certain place now need to reach down. But some of my best mentors and most supportive bosses on these work-life issues have been men.
Well, all of mine have been men.
And men are fathers of girls. They're husbands of wives. Many of them have professional lives. They get these issues today. They may not have in the past. But don't assume things because of the fact that your bosses are men. I think they're increasingly ready to have these conversations. It may not be their instinct to take you out to lunch and say, how can I help you with your work-life balance? but they, I found them to be very responsive.
It's also illegal to discriminate based on pregnancy, so don't let anyone push you around.
Let's take one more question, and I'll let you guys have some time to come up and meet our panel.
So this question kind of dovetails on what Betsy was just talking about, which is I'm finding as I'm moving up in my career, and I worked for a long time before I moved into law, so I'm a little bit older. But I'm finding the farther up I get, the more I'm starting to believe in this idea of a glass ceiling. It's not insurmountable, but certainly I'm finding with men, not that anybody doesn't believe that I have the capability, more that they don't know how to relate to me. And even with women, what I find that are above me is that we have these perfectionist tendencies. And so I'm expected to be perfect, or at least I feel that I'm expected to be perfect in a way that isn't necessarily expected from men. And it could be because how I respond to it or whatever, but I'd be very curious to hear about what your experiences have been as you've, there's a range of where you are in your careers here, so I'd be interested to hear about that.
Yeah, I'm dying to hear what Marcia has to say, actually. But I'll start with the more recent, which is, and this will sound a little provocative. I mean, a little lean-in-esque. But I'm not sure I completely agree anymore in the glass ceiling. I think there is a lot of self-selection out. I think a lot of women they think they need to make a choice, and they choose not to gun for the more senior job. And I only say that because many of my peers have done that and have come to me and said, I'm not going to accept the promotion they offered me because we're starting a family next year. I'm not going to do this because I don't think I'll be able to balance it all. And so whether or not that's happening, or whether my colleagues are a rare part of this phenomenon, I do encourage you to, if your choice is to self-select out, then by all means follow your dreams. If it isn't, don't be intimidated. I think as a result, you have attrition as you go up. And certainly as a female working in the defense industry, I am always surrounded by men, and they are all much older than me. I mean, it's just the dynamic. And, I've actually found it very, very easy to work with them, and I've had absolutely no issues whatsoever. I mean, to Betsy's point, I think they're all fathers and husbands, and so they're as supportive as anything. In fact, they say take the time you need for these kinds of things, and they reminisce about when their families were young. So I've had nothing but the best of experience, and I'm not sure whether the glass ceiling is somehow our own doing to some degree. I mean, I know I have never forcefully gone in and asked for more money in any job I've had. And I think about that now, where I watch what I believe to be shameless behavior all around me by my male counterparts who do. And so, I just think it's a time to be bold and to even if you think it might be there, just try to break it. I mean, because I really am not sure whether we perceive it or are nervous about it, but that's why I'm dying to hear what Marcia has to say.
Well, you just hit one of my... Sure.
So I think for me, it isn't so much, nobody's
right.
gonna, the promotion is there,
right.
If I want it. It's more a matter of how
do you interact.
I'm used to being told, hey, you're doing a great job, and moving forward, and then all of a sudden it's like, somehow the closer I get to being peers with people, the more, all of a sudden, I'm being more criticized a lot more. I have to fight for the bonuses, I have to fight for the promotions, as opposed to, when I was down here, it was a lot easier. And so it isn't so much that I don't think I can do the higher job.
Right. I would just say fight, because they are. They will fight ruthlessly.
That's where I start to find the difference.
That's not
it's how women
right. I said, I
think about your first year law classes and the number of times you would sit there and second guess when you should contribute, when you should speak up, what you should say, and the number of times, I love all men, the number of times your male classmates would just be like, thought, hand up, boom, right? Like they never pause to think about it. And whether it is nature, nurture, or whatever, they don't have that inhibition. That has been my observation. So you're not wrong that it gets a little bit more like this. So just get in there too.
Yeah, this really is a hot button issue for me.
Save the best for last year.
And it's really a short comment. About a decade ago, my father, who's a professor of mechanical engineering at Carnegie Mellon University, gave me for Christmas a book called Why Women Don't Ask by one of his colleagues, Linda Babcock, a sociologist. And she was in a sociology department at Carnegie Mellon, headed by a woman dean, a lot of women at the top. And she found out that she was being paid substantially less than the guys. And so she did a sociological study and wrote a book about it. And it really boils down to women feel that if they do a good job, they will be rewarded, which is not the way the world works. And so you really do have to fight. You don't have to, fight like a man. You don't have to, take your jacket off and say, okay, fine, and punch them. But you do have to fight, and you have to know how to fight. You have to know how to ask, and you have to be. You don't have to do what the guys do in first year, just. Right, and then when they get called on, they think of something to say. But I think women have had to plan and think more, have had to be more organized, have had to. The guys will fight. I've got a 30-year-old son who's 6'3" and weighs 200, and I would not want to have a fight with him. But if I'm having a dispute with somebody, and he's having the same dispute, I'm much more likely to think about an alternative to getting slugged. And so I think women have had to do that over the years. So I think we have an advantage over guys if we just use it.
Well, that's a fantastic way to end, and I think some of our major takeaways have been definitely fight for breaking through that glass ceiling and pick the right spouse. So with that, I'll let you guys mingle a little bit. If you have questions for our panelists, we have another couple of minutes, and there's probably more refreshments in the back if you'd like to help yourselves. And thank you so much again for coming. Please help me give our panelists a warm welcome.
Great story about your interview at the State Department. Oh my God.
That's just, I feel like,
Can you imagine?
I can, because I know